by acknowledging, in the spirit of reconciliation and truth-telling, the traditional custodians of the lands that we're on all over the globe, but particularly where I'm coming to here today from the Wurundjeri lands of the people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. And I do so with a real eye to deep listening. We're in a process in Victoria at the moment of establishing a Yurruk Truth and Justice Commission, which really goes to the very heart of some of the issues that we're here to talk about tonight, and gives me great hope for the future and for reconciliation. Tonight is a wonderful partnership that ANZOG has with the Centre for Public Impact, a not-for-profit foundation established by the Boston Consulting Group, aimed at working with government and thinking about how we can have more impact and do things better. So it's been a fabulous partnership. This is the second of our Reimagining Government series for 2021, building on the 7 great events that we had last year, and we've got 2 more to come that we'll talk a bit more about. So I want to get into it because we've got an absolutely fabulous panel here to talk to you. We have Dr. Suze Wilson, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Management at Massey University. Welcome to you, Suze. Great to have you here. We have Ruth Ball, who's a senior associate with CPI. And we're hoping to be joined by Jerome Harvey Agai, who's the Senior Children and Youth Participation Officer with the Greater London Authority. But we're just having a few technical issues, and we're hoping he'll be able to join us shortly. So before we jump in, there are just a few technical things I want to run through before we get into the great conversation. Can I ask everyone to stay on mute and keep your video off? I want to let you know that this session will be recorded and will be published, and will have automated captions added to it for accessibility when it's published. Can you please contribute to the conversation in many ways, including tweeting using the hashtag ReimagineGov, G-O-V, and by entering your comments and questions into the chat function while we're right now, from the beginning, feed those in. They often come in all in a rush at the end, so if you want to get in early, please jump in now. So the first thing we're going to do to open up the discussion is to invite you to identify which question we're going to start with tonight. So if Shannon could share the polling questions there. So there are 4 options.
Did you just on mute there? Sorry. It's just gone on to mute.
Thanks, Shannon. I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but thanks for the tip. So 4 options there, you can read them, but so the questions that we'll pose to the panel: in your experience, how do governments currently view listening to community? Second option, what does it mean for governments to really listen to community? Third option, can you give some examples of governments listening to diverse voices, particularly those from underrepresented groups? And fourth, what do you see as being the main barriers to listening to community, and how might we begin to address those? So we've got lots of responses coming in now. We'll just leave it open for a few more minutes. Most people have already voted, but I think it's starting to slow down. So if we go 3, 2, 1, and Shannon, if we can close that poll off. So the winning response there with a whopping 58% of responses was, what do you see as being the main barriers to listening to community, and how might we begin to address those? And in second place, can you give some examples of governments listening to diverse voices, particularly those from underrepresented groups, which I've won the sweep based on having been to 7 of these previously. I think that was the strong favourite, because we've got a lot of people here who I think are pretty convinced about the value and importance of of listening and engaging with community. And the real challenge is that's hard. How do we actually make it happen? So with that in mind, I'm going to invite Ruth to jump in and tell us what she sees as being the main barriers.
Thank you very much, Simon. And thanks everyone for coming, and that's a really interesting question that you've chosen. So I'm coming to this from the point of view of we at the Centre for Public Impact in Europe have been doing some work to listen to seldom heard groups in the northeast of England. So these groups are marginalised in various ways and have been experiencing various disadvantages and challenges, such as poverty, domestic abuse, addiction, and other challenges, and partly as a consequence of that, and as part of a few other reasons as well, they feel seldom heard in public debates. And some of the barriers when we were having conversations with these groups that they talked about were the fact that they felt most listened to through existing relationships where there was a high level of trust, lots of empathy, and also where people had an understanding of the experiences that these people have been through. So peer support groups and support workers were highlighted as people who listened particularly well. But some of the barriers to listening, because of some of those issues, and reasons why they didn't feel listened to by government, were some around centralisation sometimes. So, for instance, many people wanted to be listened to and then for there to be a response to what was heard, and quite often decision making on the issues that really mattered to these groups was made in quite distant from the people who were listening, so quite a long way away from those peer support groups and those frontline workers. Either by central government or by decision makers who were kind of further up the hierarchy and didn't have so much contact. Another barrier that came through from those conversations that we had was the issue of siloed working. So because many of these relationships were with support workers and peer support groups, these workers or groups tended to have a particular remit or a particular area of interest or a particular area of expertise. And so they were very good at listening to and responding within that particular area of expertise, but it did affect how holistically they were able to listen to people's experiences, and that was seen as a real barrier to real, genuine and deep listening. And one of the final barriers that was kind of noted by a great many people that we spoke with were the time and skills for listening that different people within public services had, that different frontline professionals and practitioners had. So, and this could be very varied. So we had many stories of fantastic professionals who were able to make the extra time to listen to people's stories and people's holistic experiences, who demonstrated excellent skills around active listening and listening with empathy. And then we also heard a great many stories, unfortunately, where that wasn't the case, where either the skills were lacking or the time was lacking, or there really was, the professional really wanted to listen, but kind of lacked for some reason, lacked the ability to do so, and that desire didn't quite come across. So those were the key barriers that kind of came out through those conversations. There are several other barriers that sit behind that.
Thanks, Ruth. That's fantastic, and a lot to come back to in that answer as well. Suze, what are your reflections on those barriers?
Thanks. So I'm a leadership scholar, so when we were kind of prepping for this session, we thought it might be helpful so that there is a diversity of views, that I kind of come at this from thinking specifically about what all of this means in terms of leadership. And I think if like one of the kind of macro level barriers around all of this is essentially the kind of the culturally dominant notion of leadership is still quite strongly rooted in kind of heroic notions that the leader knows best, and that particularly in a situation of crisis or confusion or complexity, that somehow the leader should command what the response is. And so when we try to lead differently, by actually being more open, by being more inclusive, by saying, I don't necessarily know what the answer is here, but I think these are some useful questions for us to explore in dialogue. There's quite a strong risk that that will be perceived as not leadership because it runs against the cultural norm. And so I think this process of transition that we're kind of in terms of our cultural norms is something that we just, for people in leadership roles, they have to be alert to try and figure out where might be the boundary that you can push to in trying to change leadership practice to open that space for genuine listening without risking being perceived as kind of completely inept and directionless. And that's a really, difficult balancing act, I think to find. I think that a second barrier is, even if we're committed to that shift, it's actually incredibly hard work. The more you listen as a leader, the more you're going to expose yourself to all the range of competing perspectives. And they're then going to be sitting in your consciousness for you to grapple with. It's much easier in some sense to just not kind of open the box and look at all the stuff that's in there, because then you can kind of pretend it doesn't exist. So it's actually incredibly hard work, and it creates a bigger challenge in terms of trying to navigate and moderate all of those competing pressures. And most of us don't go looking for even harder work than we've already got. That just the day job is quite demanding. Associated, I think, with that then is an enormous level of persistence and resilience that people leading in this different way need to find to sustain themselves in this different practice, knowing that they may not personally reap the rewards, they may not even necessarily get recognition for what they're doing, but that believing in that this new way of engaging is going to generate greater collective benefit, and just being committed to that cause. Again, that's not an easy ask, is it? So those would be a few of the kind of initial thoughts that I've got in relation to this.
Great, thanks, Suze. That's a fantastic frame and setting up just the challenge that we have here. And it links beautifully, actually, to what I see as a great story of success that you've written about, which is the leadership of Jacinda Ardern through COVID in particular, but I think you could apply it to some of her other leadership as well. You wrote a year ago about her success, both in making the really tough decisions and then in communicating them. And I think there's a link between those two things. One of the things you did in writing about that was that you invited the reader to imagine what it was like to be the leader making those tough decisions, and the weight of responsibility, the life and death responsibilities, creating empathy in both directions. You also highlighted that she brought the population, well, I would describe as she brought the population into her trust by dealing with some of those really tough trade-offs and explaining, we've got a range of tough choices here. There's no great option. I've got to make the decision, and this is why I've made it, which is unusual. I thought that was just a wonderful way of framing it, and I think a great lesson. What I'm really interested in is, what were the conditions that were in place that allowed Jacinda Ardern to lead in the way that she did?
So I think that part of what helped is that she had established a level of credibility in terms of crisis leadership pre-pandemic through her approach to the Christchurch terror attacks. And in that sense, there was, if you like, a level of pre-existing trust that she could draw on in terms of trying to take the population through this really dramatic change in our daily lives. One of the key features that I think of her approach and the government's kind of positioning in relation to the pandemic generally was to pair the Prime Minister up with the head of our health system and with other public health experts to provide independent expert advice and to then show consistently how the government was trying to take decisions consistent with the advice that they were getting from relevant experts. And this helped depoliticise in many ways the response to the pandemic as not just about, well, I'm doing this to try and make the Labour Party look good, but more about, I'm doing this because my concern is actually governing for the well-being of all New Zealanders. And because there was this, high level of transparency between what was the advice coming out of the Ministry of Health and other scientists contributing to public discourse and what the government's general strategy was, I think that also built trust. As you mentioned, she's quite assiduous in laying out the reasons behind the decisions, which brings a sense of transparency to the process. And particularly when she's framing a decision, there's kind of three key notes that she tries to sound in terms of enabling her communication to be impactful. So she provides direction. She also explains why things matter. So I'm asking you to stay at home to save lives. Okay, so it's not just I'm asking you to stay home because that's what we want you to do. It's I'm asking you to stay home because that's going to save lives. That's a pretty important job that I'm just giving you all. And then she balances that with empathy. I get that this is going to be really hard for you. We're going to be here for you. You need to support each other, And that model of direction giving, meaning making and empathy is actually something that a couple of American leadership communication scholars developed. And as I was watching what she was doing, I was going, oh my God, she's hitting all three notes. Their research suggests generally leaders do far too much of direction giving, not nearly enough of the meaning making and empathy, and she's actually very skillful at balancing those things, and that helps people understand what's expected of them, why it's important, but also to feel that the leader understands what all of this means for them, and that helps carry people along as well.
Absolutely, and I think that where you started there around the importance of trust that she had established before she was in the midst of a crisis was what she was then able to draw down on, which I think picks up on one of the comments there from Janet in the chat around it's one thing to listen, but then it's another thing to actually act and to go through that process. Listen and to not see anything change actually erodes trust, and how to create that virtuous cycle. Ruth, I'm just wanting to pull you in here on that point around really what do you do when trust has been eroded, because your research there, done the Learning to Listen Again report where you've gone out and listened, shows really confirms both what Suze is saying and Janet's comment about the importance of the follow-through and the goodwill and the reciprocity of that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And so and it is an interesting and kind of quite nuanced point as well, because we did see examples of where people were listened to by a really someone who was really empathetic, someone who listened really well, and actually perhaps the response wasn't responding to everything that was said, but the empathy and the kind of experience of the listening had been a positive experience anyway. But I think part of that is setting expectations for what the response can be. So we have lots of experiences of people who feel like they've had some really good listening from frontline professionals who couldn't, attend to everything that was raised. So there is that sort of expectation setting that can really set listening up to feel like good listening or to not feel like good listening. And I think when people's expectations are not met, that's where the problem really arises, when they share their stories with an expectation that actually this thing's going to be solved, this thing's going to be solved, this thing's going to be solved, or at least it will be taken to a decision maker who will then make a response. And then if that doesn't happen or doesn't appear to happen, that's when the trust can really break down. So it's an interesting and nuanced point, and people do want different things from being listened to. But that setting of expectations is really important. But yes, certainly one of the things that came through loud and clear from the research that we did was that really good listening exists very well at a local level and at the level of community. So one of the messages that came through quite a lot from our conversations was that national government, central government doesn't listen to them, and we don't listen to them either. And there was that kind of almost slightly antagonistic relationship. And that was regardless of who was the Prime Minister or who were the politicians in particular. It was that kind of feeling of a very long period of time that they hadn't been listened to by national government, and that had kind of just led to a bit of a breakdown in that relationship. And so one of the things that's been really interesting is to see how during the pandemic and during the response to the pandemic, governments and public services have been trying to use some of those local relationships and those kind of community leaders to help inform the messaging, to help get messaging out about the pandemic, and that's been a really important and useful thing for government to be doing alongside the more central messaging that resonates with some people, but actually for a lot of audiences doesn't really resonate that well. So that's kind of it's been but working slightly differently, but very much using those local relationships where possible, and that seems to have been quite successful in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I think that's really fascinating, and I think links back to one of the earlier points you made around silos and expertise. And I think the tension there between the people that are close and on the ground and have the relationships and are listening, but government, the need for deep expertise kind of carving their lives up into smaller and smaller chunks, and the people who are doing the listening and having the empathy not having the levers to deliver on that they sit elsewhere. One, I'm wondering if that fits with, that's kind of my practitioner experience from working in government, but one, whether that came through in your research and your discussions, and two, what thoughts you have about how to kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, that absolutely came through. So the idea that a support worker, for instance, who might be for someone who has experience of kind of addiction, you might have a support worker who's particularly working with you on your recovery journey, but there might be other issues, for instance, around housing or physical health needs or other needs that this person won't necessarily be able to help you with. And so while you might have a fantastic relationship and this person might be listening and gaining a really holistic understanding of what your life is, your lived experience, and you kind of both invested a lot in that relationship, they can only respond to quite a limited set of things within that. And there is I don't think anyone's, fully cracked this by any means, but certainly improving that collaboration between different agencies and different sectors and organizations at a local level, so that at an individual level you can have kind of teams around people that work really well, but are also kind of based on, where are the really trusting relationships within these teams. And then at a more kind of organizational and system level, helping those organizations to link up better across the piece and work more holistically so that they're able to respond to a wider range of needs. And linked to this as well is thinking about how we can move decision-making power so it's as close to the people who are being served as possible. Because at the moment you sometimes have this situation where the decision that needs to be made is made quite a long distance away from those frontline practitioners or those peer support groups who really are doing this listening, have this really great understanding of a person's life, but lack the authority and ability to make decisions that would really make a difference. So there's something about devolving decision making as well, so that it happens a lot closer to the front lines. But yeah, I wouldn't say anyone's fully cracked these issues yet, but those are some initial thoughts.
Great. Thank you. And yeah, it is, and it's a recurring theme through the ninth in this series, this challenge of decision-making, rights connection, siloing, and the authorising environment in which we all operate. I think a theme that I can see emerging is kind of the potential for both a virtuous cycle of trust and connection begetting trust and connection, but also the reverse of an absence of trust and connection begetting a further breakdown in trust. And I'm interested in both of your perspectives, coming at it from quite different angles. Suze, you having looked at it from a leadership and a national leadership level, and Ruth looking at it much closer to the ground about where things are going in the wrong direction, where we've got this vicious cycle. What are the opportunities for circuit breaking to start to the first bit of trust, I suppose, is the hardest bit to build. The second bit is a bit easier, and the third bit a bit more, if you can break it down like that. Suze, do you want to have a go at that very straightforward question I've just posed for you?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that part of the solution lies in trying to be really discerning about who we let into leadership roles. So we know there's a whole body of research about what power does to it. Power does to our psychology and actually our physiology. So when we feel that when we are in a position of power, we generally feel energized. We've actually kind of got more, if you like, energy hormones. We feel more positive. We feel more resilient. We feel more optimistic. These are useful things. But we're also much more likely to be self-serving, hypocritical, that the rules that apply to us are not the same rules that should apply to my people, including my mate Dominic Cummings. So there are these real dangers that go with leadership and power, and the more we can educate people who are going into leadership roles to be alert to these dangers, the more we can be discerning about not mistaking confidence for competence. Okay, because if we can talk, Boris talks a good game at times, right? But the delivery is, generally speaking, a long way behind. And so what he's got is confidence, but not competence. And that's generally a common pattern that we find when we see bad leadership, is that they talk a good talk, but the substance isn't there, and there's a orientation of being self-serving. So the more we can educate leaders, the more we can educate people who are in a position to vote for or employ people into leadership roles to be more discerning, that would help. And then I think we have to try to engage people in leadership roles to understand that they've got to find a way to hold this paradox of they've got this power, but they have to use it to empower others. Okay? So in some sense, they have to always be involved in this process of this seemingly cutting off their own legs in order to actually allow collective capability, because when we're talking about wicked problems, no one person can solve it at all. The more we can actually enable people to contribute their voice, their expertise, to get involved in actually solving things together, the better placed we're going to be. There's not going to be a white knight on a horse coming over the hill to save us from climate change. It's something that we're all deeply implicated in, just as an example. So I think those would be some steps to try and bring us more to a circle of virtue, but not being naive that this is really hard and we are resisting urges all the time, and being, you know, diligent and cautious, and trying to keep a watch on ourselves. There's a really interesting body of research that started in the UK around hubris, or in fact what they call hubris syndrome. You know, coming to a former Prime Minister near you, you might think. And what that body of research is suggesting is that it's an acquired personality disorder. So, you know, again, it's just another piece of evidence suggesting the potentially dangerous impact that having power can, and the more we can balance the power that leaders have with countervailing powers, the better chance we've got of not seeing them turn toxic and dysfunctional, and also getting the collective involved in solving collective problems. Yeah.
Yeah. The Weber's slow boring of hard boards comes to mind in as you were talking, as does, I think, the challenge of that's what's being rewarded in the system right now. That's what kind of media hits, media bite, kind of voting trends have tended to reinforce that. But I'll put that to one side and ask Ruth the similarly tough question of how to break the circuit of mistrust and declining connection.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I want to pick up on what Susan's saying about empowerment, because I think that's really crucial in this. I think where it's very easy to lose trust in a relationship, and it takes a lot of time to build trust in a relationship. And so where a relationship has broken down, there's something really important about understanding where there are still good relationships that exist and empowering those, so that the people who want to be heard, need to be heard, should be heard, are heard within those relationships. And then both those people themselves and also the professionals who are working with them with these great relationships are empowered as much as possible to make the changes that need to happen. And what we've seen from the work that we've done is that can happen really, really well at a particularly local level. Because most of the things we're looking at when we look at kind of individual people's lives and all of the challenges that they might be facing, these are all incredibly complex problems. There's certainly no one-size-fits-all solution. Kind of things mandated from the centre can only really get you so far in those circumstances. So it's very much about kind of working out what are the local solutions, what are the solutions for particular individuals, particular community groups. And so empowering the people who are involved in those conversations to make the changes that they need to see is a kind of really important way to help not only help them solve the immediate problems that they're facing, which is beneficial anyway, but it does show kind of that trust in the people who are experiencing those problems to be able to solve those problems. And then where we know relationships aren't necessarily so trusted at the moment. So for instance, with kind of people who are more removed in government, with central government, for instance, actually that show of trust and demonstration of trusting these people in these groups to be able to solve problems and supporting them to do so could be a really nice way of helping grow and develop that relationship and develop more trust within that relationship. So I think empowerment is a really important point there. But again, I certainly see this as being quite a long-term thing, because growing trust, especially from the stories that we've been listening to and that we've been hearing, it's going to take quite a long time to repair those relationships. So it's probably, step by step and shows of faith that might seem small, but will add up to something that's really helpful for that relationship.
Yeah, that's a great encapsulation there, Ruth, around I think the typical answer is probably, well, first of all, that it's small steps. It's how do you have something to build on? Start with something that's achievable and move on. But I think the typical answer has been for government to find a reason, show a reason why it should be trusted. And I think what you're saying is this is a reciprocal relationship, and actually government trusting people to make some of their own decisions is the other way, or another way of building that trust and relationship. So fantastic way into it. So we're not far from going into breakout rooms, but I just have one more question before we do. So my working hypothesis as a former practitioner is that not only, as Ruth has found in her research, that there's a strong desire to be listened to more, I think there's a strong desire by people in government to do more listening, and yet we don't have as much listening. So that is a bit of a conundrum. If people want to be listened to and we want to listen, why isn't it happening more? And I've kind of got two thoughts to put there. One is kind of a leadership paradigm, and Marty Linsky from the Kennedy School was out in Melbourne 3 or 4 years ago and said something that really resonated with me, which is leadership is dancing at the very edge of your authority. If you're too far from the edge of your authority, it's not leadership. And if you're too far out from the edge of your authority, you're in trouble and you're acting beyond your authority. So that says there's agency there. And the second idea is the fundamental attribution error, that we have a tendency to overemphasize personal agency and underemphasize situational explanations in why things happen. So kind of holding those two thoughts, how do we balance that need for individual leadership and action with the situational constraints that everyone in any organisation faces, whether they're a frontline service worker or the leader of the country and everyone in between? No one is without those situational constraints. What's the sweet spot and the balance between those two, and what can we do? Ruth. Again, I'm asking big, difficult questions.
It's a really fascinating question as well. I think thinking back to what people were saying about those professionals who listened well, I think it's having the confidence, capability, ability to recognise the limitations of the system, but also in different ways to be able to overcome them to kind of deal with the situation that's in front of you. And I think, so thinking about some of the stories that we heard about people who were really good listeners, it's people who could listen holistically, set those expectations about what the response could be, but also kind of demonstrated being able to go a little bit above and beyond, this is what the direct remit is, this is what I think I can change, but also being able to build relationships across the system, leveraging other support from other places, or sometimes just being able to having the ability, the time to go the extra mile to, if someone working with someone who might be struggling to get to the shops to pick up their medicine, to be able to, either find someone to deliver it to their home or to be able to do it themselves, those kind of going the extra mile things that we've been seeing during the pandemic. And that's hugely appreciated. And I think that sort of works up the hierarchy. So where frontline practitioners are empowered to do this, I think it's because managers and others in the organisation are able to kind of cross those organisational boundaries, build relationships with others, and kind of find different ways to make it work, even when the system is not helping you to make it work. So I would say that kind of there's a role for working out ways to work across organizations in different ways, experimenting with different ways, freeing up those people in frontline roles and those peer support groups to be able to be imaginative, to respond to things in different ways, to experiment and be innovative. And that's where things do seem to be working a lot better. But yeah, it's a big question.
And that's a great answer. Thank you. Suze, before we go into breakout rooms?
Yeah, and I'm appreciative of having had a couple of minutes to think about an answer because it was such a tricky question. I think that sort of a meta competency that's really important we try and develop in leaders is essentially this notion of cognitive complexity, the ability to hold competing views in our mind at the same time and not be kind of undone by the tension and complexity of that. And I think if we have that, then we can have a sense of both working within the system but also on the system. And so we're kind of having to, in some sense, bend to some of its constraints, but also looking, you know, literally from moment to moment, where is there something that I could do that's going to nudge it a bit in the direction that I think I need to go in. And you know, in that sense, being mindful that, you know, the bulk of leadership work is not about kind of standing up at the big press conference or speech doing a la la la. It's the kind of daily conversations that we're having with people, and how is it that we are supporting them to think beyond what we have now? How is it that we're creating a space for people to feel confident that they can speak truth to power, and help us understand where there are opportunities. It's very easy, I think, particularly if you've been in a leadership role for a period of time, to want to start defending your own legacy. And what you really need is an environment where people are going to keep telling you, actually, your baby's quite ugly today, so that you stay in touch with that stuff. And people, again, I'm coming back to the empowerment word, but people feel confident that you are encouraging and supporting them to also go out and look for where those boundaries that we can push. And when we push over a sustained period of time, then we do start to see change. And that's really what we need to think of as the role of leadership. And in that sense, it's more about asking questions to see possibilities than it is necessarily about having answers. We can do a lot more, we can unleash a lot more energy by asking questions and posing, getting people in that possibility space, rather than, you know, just maintaining the status quo.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you. So we will be back, but right now we're going to move people into breakout rooms to continue the discussion in smaller groups. And as a participant in past Reimagining Government webinars, it's been, I found it really, really enjoyable to engage directly with other participants. So what we're going to do is break people up into smaller groups. You'll get an invitation shortly on the screen. These groups are optional. If you don't want to do that, if you want to go away and make a cup of tea, just sit and chill and relax, that's entirely your option, in which case click later. If you do want to join a group, click join a group. And what we want you to do is to think about these three questions. What about you've just heard that is most resonated with you? What things did you disagree with? And I really would love to hear, because I think that's where some of the friction and the learning comes from, is where there are some different points of view. And really critically, what might you change in your own practice to make these ideas real? What change can you create? Where could you be on dancing at the edge of your authority in Linsky's terms? So if you can talk about those questions, we've got 15 minutes, so we'll come back on the hour. That'll be 6 p.m. Melbourne time, but I know we've got people in many time zones, so on the hour. If I can ask people to identify a scribe, and I suggest, unless somebody's free to put their hand up, but otherwise go with the person whose surname is closest to the start of the alphabet. So if there are anyone with aardvark in their name, you are going to win. If not, work your way through the alphabet. We'll come back in 15 minutes, and if the scribes can then enter those comments into the chat, because we will gather all of that really rich content up and circulate it afterwards. So you'll get the reflections from the groups you're not in. So if I can ask the host to invite people off into groups, and we'll see you back here on the hour. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a stimulating discussion with colleagues and colleagues from all around the world, in my experience. So a great way to connect with people you may not otherwise have contact with. So can I invite the scribes from the various groups to start inputting into the chat function what your feedback was, and we're really looking forward to hearing that feedback. And Susan and I were just discussing in particular what practice changes you might take away from tonight, because there was actually a wonderful frame from Jerome, who, as you can see, hasn't been able to overcome the technical difficulties. But he talked in a similar webinar in November last year on this report about listening from the heart and really hearing people where they're at, because listening from the heart creates a thought, and a thought becomes a feeling, and that feeling drives change. So if you think about what that change might look like for you, because otherwise it's a conversation and we can all really enjoy that and get stimulated from it, but what are you going to take away as change? And I kind of invoke Jerome in his absence, unfortunately, in thinking about that. So while you input your feedback from those discussions, and indeed any questions that you want to feed into the chat, I just want to go back to this. Well, actually, I'm inviting a little bit of feedback. For a long time, I was a senior public servant in Victorian government, and this was a kind of an issue I grappled with really regularly, about the agency that I had in my work. Being caught between an Auditor General's set of findings telling me I needed to do one thing, or a statutory obligation telling me that I was the decision maker and I needed to do this. And on the other hand, my agency in that, and thinking, okay, well, it's not going to change if I don't change it. And in the moment, it can be really hard to know, am I playing it safe here? Am I being conservative? Am I saving up my pennies to spend at a later date and I'm never going to get around to spending them? Or am I out beyond the limits of my authority, or more technically known as being out on a limb? So they're really hard things. So I'm interested, Suze and Ruth, about what advice you would give to me in the past, or indeed to any practitioner, and it can be any practitioner anywhere in the system for that matter. It can be from frontline service delivery up to the head of an agency, or indeed a minister or a head of government. So Suze, I'll start with you.
It's a tension that I totally connect with. Although leadership is not just about an individual leader, it is about a relational dynamic. If you are in that leadership position, there's no getting past, I think, the reality that it's going to test your character. And we often don't talk these days about character in relation to leadership and leadership development. We just talk about competencies, but actually character is even more fundamental. And I think there's no way of getting past that. In those moments, what we have to find is courage. And courage is this really tenuous thing, right? And it's kind of like, okay, and kind of step over the edge, and then you're free falling. It's like, oh no, that's too far. So like actually understanding that acts of courage, it's this roller coaster from moment to moment. But being clear, I need to find courage to challenge this boundary, to take this conversation forward. It's going to be scary, but feeling afraid and nonetheless doing it actually is by definition what courage involves. And you know, finding it within us to do that. And you know, I think so often when we find that moment of courage to make a different contribution to the conversation, there will be others who are then, we help them find courage. So we have to understand it's not just us alone. We're trying to create a permission space for others to come into this with us. And it won't work out necessarily for the best all the time. But if we don't find that courage, then nothing will ever change.
And even listening to you there, Suze, that evoked in me moments when I'd done that, and I think summoning the success of those moments when they do work, to use them the next time to say, actually, it's uncomfortable, but it was worth that effort. It was worth the discomfort, and drawing down on that.
I think in that sense that if our orientation in terms of leadership is more about, I'm going to try this and see what I learn. I'm going to try this because I believe the cause is right. And it's better that I try this even if it doesn't work out than being driven by a fear of failure. You know, we kind of have to instill that aspect of our character as well, to be driven, you know, by those things and not by our fears. Yeah,
and another great theme that's come through the whole series around the importance of failure and risk taking. Thank you so much, Suze. Ruth.
Yeah, to absolutely agree and echo with that theme of courage, I would say, which is really important, and one of the things that really came out of our work as well. So advice to those who might be in frontline roles, who might be in this event or might be listening, would be that listening holistically to the people that you work with is incredibly valuable, even though it might feel uncomfortable at first. And what we've heard both from the kind of staff who were listening in the work that we were doing is that listening holistically and outside the boundaries of how they would normally listen to the people they would work with has helped develop better relationship, give them a better understanding, make them more effective as practitioners. And certainly from the people who are engaging with public services, we've heard again and again and again that they want to be listened to, they want to be able to tell their stories, and to have them be heard by people in positions of power who make decisions. Provided expectations are set at the beginning of listening about, you know, how you might respond to certain things that come up, I would certainly encourage those people in those kinds of roles to think about how to build in that wider, more holistic listening, experiment with it, find out what works for you, find out what works within your organization, because it can look very, very differently from organization to organization. But I would certainly recommend having a look at it and thinking about it, because it certainly is hugely valued by the people who have tried to do these things. And for people in more senior roles who might be in management roles and not in frontline roles anymore, I think it's similar to what Suze is saying, thinking about how to really empower that listening and empower that response, which is sometimes about giving up power and giving up being the expert in the room, which might also feel uncomfortable, but also thinking about what might your role be in supporting that learning, in supporting that response, and in supporting that listening to happen closer to the ground. And I think those are some really interesting conversations that we've started having with a few different organizations, and I would definitely urge anyone to have those conversations within your own organizations and your own teams.
Thanks, Ruth. And a lot of very similar themes as I'm just looking at some of the things that people are inputting into the chat from the group discussions around being clear about expectations, and that empowering and giving up power is coming through really strongly. I think time is really against us at this point, but I think we've got time to go to one more question, and picking up on a theme where Moira is reporting back, which I think really builds nicely on that, which is the comment there is we have to be prepared to manage our emotional response to giving up power. And I think, that's a great self-reflection, a great piece of self-awareness. Conscious of time, tips that either of you can offer on that very personal experience of managing that emotional response of giving up power and how to do it. Suze, I'll go to you. Thanks.
So I think you want to try and give yourself opportunities to practice, so that you're not doing this suddenly in a really high stakes environment where nobody else is prepared that this is how you're going to approach your leadership work. So finding small opportunities where you hold back giving your opinion and turn it back into a question to others and see where they run with it. So potentially with your own team is a good place to start. And then as you're going through that experience, noticing what's going on for you and just trying to suspend judgment from that. So just noticing that, it feels like it's a little bit scary right now, but it's going to be okay. Now I'm starting to settle myself down. So finding ways to navigate those particular moments when the urge to just jump in and go, no, here is the answer, becomes overwhelming, and learning how to hold that back. If any of you practice yoga, I think yoga is a really good way to learn how to hold ourselves in moments of discomfort, and not be caught in it emotionally. Just notice, oh yeah, that hamstring's got a lot to say to me right now, doesn't it? And I've really used that message off the mat in my teaching, because often you want to you throw a question to the students and then there's just this silence, and I now make it my mission that I will hold that silence for much longer than anyone else, because I am determined that they will be the next person to speak, not me. And it's actually it's taken me years of practice, and now I'm just like, oh yeah, they're up to 30 seconds, that's okay. They're looking uncomfortable, I'm sweet. So just practicing until you just learn to notice, oh yeah, that's happening, that's okay, I've done this before, it'll be okay this time.
What a great reflection about expanding your comfort zone, and what used to be uncomfortable is now comfortable. Thank you. That's great reflection. Ruth, to you.
Yeah, just to echo everything, and also to add the importance of support networks. So where people have been sort of trying to have these less comfortable conversations and stretching themselves, one of the things that people have told us is really helpful is support from others in similar roles, so either other frontline support roles or other kind of managerial, more senior roles, who are going through similar experiences, and being able to share, just vent, and also just to be able to share experiences and tips and tricks, for how you handle the response to that. So I would definitely think about that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to both Suze and Ruth. It's been a real privilege to have the opportunity to have this time with you and to have this discussion. I've really enjoyed it, as I'm sure our many participants around the globe have as well. So thank you, really heartfelt, for your contributions. It's been fantastic. Thanks to everyone who's come along tonight. We really value your participation. We hope to see you again at the next event. That will be on the 17th of August, exploring the theme of meaningful measurement. That'll be hosted by my colleague Jane Frances Kelly, who is the Deputy CEO Education here at ANZOG. And the other panellists, she'll have the panellists Adrian Brown, the Executive Director of CPI, Sarah Fernandez, CEO of Oxford Hub, and Professor Jenny Lewis, who's Professor of Public Policy at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. So register for that one and look forward to seeing you here for that. Between now and then, we'd love you to access the Reimagining Government Series website. This is something we've added this year so that the conversation can continue, that there are resources there, there's some readings, but most importantly, it's an opportunity to continue this conversation online over the next week or two, and indeed beyond that. We'd also love you to join our community of practice, which you can do via the website, and we'll be hosting some interactive sessions, conversations and networking opportunities in the future. Also, please, we really value your feedback. We'll send out a short post-webinar survey. Love to hear your thoughts. We do look at it really closely and incorporate it into the design of future events. And as I indicated, we will extract all of the information that's been gathered in the chat, capture that in a Google Doc, and publish that on the microsite as well. So a chance to hear and see the recording of this, or indeed if you're watching the recording now, hi. And to see all of the contributions that people have made and be able to delve into those fantastic contributions. So thank you all. Fantastic to have you here. Fantastic discussion. Thanks, Suze and Ruth. And we'll see you on the 17th of August.